I need to get this out because honestly, you guys are the only people who might understand how satisfying this feels without judging me for being petty. And yeah, I'm being petty. I own it. So this happened about 14 months ago. My engagement party. Stephanie and I had been together 3 years, and I proposed on a random Thursday because she mentioned she loved how the sunset looked that evening. Nothing fancy, just us at the park near her apartment. She said yes. Her parents were thrilled. My mom cried happy tears. My dad, Abraham, did what he always does. He made a comment about how I better not expect him to pay for a wedding when I couldn't even afford my own life. Background real quick because you need to understand the dynamic here. Abraham is one of those guys who measures success exclusively in visible wealth. He owns a commercial property business that his father started, so he grew up comfortable and made it bigger. Good for him, genuinely. But somewhere along the way, he decided that anyone who doesn't follow his exact blueprint is a failure. I'm 28. I graduated with a business degree that Abraham paid for because he assumed I'd join his company. Instead, I started working with a friend on a tech startup. We were building an inventory management platform for small retailers. Not sexy, not flashy. But we had clients and we were growing slowly. Abraham hated this. He called it playing entrepreneur. He told everyone I was wasting my degree and my potential. When the startup needed capital 2 years in, I asked him for a loan. Not a gift, a loan with terms and interest. He said no, told me I needed to learn real business first, and offered me a job doing property inspections for him instead. I declined. He got mad. From that point on, every family gathering included some comment about my choices. Here's the thing, though. I was living in an apartment Abraham owned. He charged me rent, below market rate, and yeah, I drove his old Lexus SUV that he wasn't using anymore. He held this over me constantly. Stephanie made more than me at her marketing job, and we split expenses based on income, which meant she paid more. Abraham loved bringing this up. My useless son who needs his girlfriend to support him. The engagement party was at my parents' house. Stephanie's family came, my extended family, some friends. About 40 people total. Everything was fine until Abraham decided to give a toast. I should have known. The man cannot resist a captive audience. He stood up, raised his glass, and started with congratulations. Then he pivoted. Let's all congratulate my useless son Warren, the future husband who can't even afford his own engagement ring. Still living in daddy's rental property, still driving daddy's old car, still playing entrepreneur while his fiancée pays half his bills. Isn't that romantic? Maybe we should start a GoFundMe for the wedding. People laughed. They actually laughed. Some of them thought he was joking, doing that aggressive dad humor thing. Others knew better, but laughed anyway because what else do you do when someone's father roasts them publicly? Stephanie's face went pale. My mom looked mortified. And my cousin Edward, who's always been Abraham's little cheerleader, yelled out that maybe Stephanie should adopt me so I could finally have a real dad. More laughter. Phones came out. People were filming this. I could see them trying to be subtle about it, but yeah, they were recording my humiliation for posterity. I smiled. I kissed Stephanie's forehead. I raised my own glass and said something about Abraham keeping everyone entertained as always, how we appreciated everyone coming to celebrate with us. I acted like it was all just dark family humor. What else could I do? Make a scene? Storm out? That's what Abraham wanted. He wanted me to react, to prove I was emotional and unstable and couldn't handle real life. Stephanie squeezed my hand under the table. She knew how angry I was. We'd been together long enough that she could read me. But I kept smiling through the rest of the party, made small talk, thanked people for coming. Later that night, I went to grab something from my car and heard voices from the garage. The side door was open a crack. I recognized my uncle's voice, Abraham's younger brother who works in the business with him. He was talking to another uncle and they were discussing me. The gist was that Stephanie would wake up within a year and leave the broke clown. That I was one missed paycheck away from begging Abraham forever. That she seemed sweet but clearly didn't understand what she was signing up for. That Abraham was too generous letting me live cheap and drive his car, and I'd never survive on my own. They were laughing about it, making bets about how long until the startup failed completely. I stood there in the dark driveway listening to my own family lay out exactly how pathetic they thought I was. And something shifted in me right then. Not sadness, not shame, pure cold anger. See, here's what Abraham didn't know, what none of them knew. The startup? We'd just closed a Series A funding round. Not huge money, but enough to scale properly. My equity stake was now worth actual money on paper. We had a plan to expand into 3 new markets. I had been keeping this quiet because Abraham had a habit of claiming credit for anything good in my life while blaming me for anything bad. I didn't want him involved in my success. The apartment I lived in, the one Abraham owned and lorded over me? I'd been researching property values in that neighborhood, doing market analysis. The building had appreciated significantly, and Abraham was sitting on equity he didn't need but kept anyway because it gave him leverage over me. That car he let me drive? I'd been saving separately for months. I could buy my own car whenever I wanted. I kept driving his because it seemed wasteful to have two vehicles when Stephanie and I were planning to move in together properly anyway. Stephanie paying more of our expenses? We'd structured it that way deliberately so I could funnel more money into savings and into the business. She supported the long-term plan. We were partners. But Abraham saw what he wanted to see, a son who couldn't provide. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed next to Stephanie, who'd fallen asleep exhausted from the stress of the party, and I planned. Not some elaborate movie revenge, just cold, practical steps. I was done playing the grateful son who accepted scraps and insults. I was done letting Abraham control the narrative. The next morning, Stephanie and I talked for 3 hours. I told her everything I was thinking. She didn't tell me to let it go or be the bigger person. She said she'd been waiting for me to get angry enough to act, that she loved me, but watching Abraham tear me down constantly made her want to tear him down too. We made lists. We talked about boundaries and consequences and what we were willing to do. First step was simple. I gave Abraham notice that I was moving out of his apartment, 30 days as required by our rental agreement. He called me immediately asking what my problem was. I told him no problem. Stephanie and I were moving in together properly and wanted our own place. He asked how I planned to afford market rate rent. I said we'd figure it out like adults do. He didn't like that. He started lecturing me about burning bridges and how I'd come crawling back when reality hit. I let him talk. I didn't argue. I just said the decision was made. Stephanie and I found a place within 2 weeks, nicer than Abraham's rental, which irritated him when he found out. We furnished it with stuff we actually picked out together. I bought a used SUV, nothing fancy but reliable, and mine. Returned Abraham's Lexus with a thank you note. He texted asking if I was trying to prove something. I didn't respond. The startup kept growing. We signed 2 major clients in the fall. My equity kept increasing in value. I still didn't tell Abraham any of this. He assumed I was struggling because that fit his narrative. Thanksgiving was tense. Abraham made comments about our new apartment, asking how we were managing the rent, wondering out loud if Stephanie's parents were helping us. I smiled and changed the subject. Christmas was worse. He gave me a gift card to a discount grocery store and said something about helping out since times were tight. Stephanie's jaw clenched, but she stayed quiet. I spent months just living my life, building my business, being happy with Stephanie. But I was also watching Abraham, paying attention to his patterns, his properties, his business moves. Not stalking, just being aware. He'd trained me my whole life to understand commercial real estate. After all, I knew how his operation worked. Then around month 10 after the engagement party, something interesting happened. One of Abraham's long-term commercial tenants decided not to renew. Prime location. And Abraham was counting on that income. He scrambled to find a replacement, but the market had shifted. He was asking too much rent for the area. I didn't cause this. I just watched it happen. And I waited. Month 11, another tenant gave notice. Abraham started getting stressed. I could tell from how he acted at family dinners. More irritable than usual. Snapping at my mom, making even more comments about my life choices, like he needed someone to look down on. Then month 12 hit. Stephanie and I got married. Small ceremony, just immediate family and close friends. Abraham gave a speech that included 3 separate jabs about financial responsibility. I smiled through all of it. And then, month 14, last week, my phone rang at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday. Abraham's name on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. He was calling about a property, one of his commercial buildings. Turns out another major tenant was leaving, and he was having serious cash flow issues. The building needed repairs he'd been putting off. He wanted to know if my little tech thing was doing well enough that I might want to invest in real estate, partner with him on renovating the property. He'd give me a good deal on equity stake. I told him I'd think about it. He kept talking, explaining the opportunity, how it could be a good learning experience for me. His voice had this edge to it I'd never heard before. Not quite desperate, but getting there. I hung up and just sat there. Stephanie asked what he wanted. I told her. She started laughing. Not mean laughter, just this amazed, disbelieving laugh. Because Abraham, the man who'd spent years telling me I'd never survive without him, was now asking me for money. I haven't called him back yet. I'm sitting on this, thinking about my next move. The revenge isn't about making him suffer. It's about making him see. Making him understand that his version of my life was never accurate. That I was never the failure he kept telling everyone I was. So yeah, that's where I am. Waiting, planning, watching my phone for the next call, because I know it's coming. Update to follow when things develop. Trust me, this is just getting started. Update 1. Okay, so the comments on my last post were wild. Shout out to everyone who said to let Abraham sweat. You called it. That's exactly what I did. And man, it got interesting fast. Abraham called again 3 days after that first call. Same time, late at night. This time he opened with asking how I was doing, how Stephanie was. Small talk that felt completely foreign coming from him. Then he circled back to the property investment opportunity. He'd had time to think about the terms, he said. He could offer me a better equity percentage than he'd initially mentioned. Really good deal for someone my age trying to build wealth. I told him I appreciated him thinking of me, but I needed to run the numbers, talk to Stephanie, see if it made sense for us financially. He got quiet for a second, then asked how the tech business was going, not in his usual dismissive way. He actually sounded like he wanted to know. I kept my answer vague, going well, staying busy, learning a lot. He pushed a little, asking about revenue, client base. I deflected, said I didn't want to bore him with details since he'd always found it uninteresting. He didn't have a response to that. Before we hung up, he mentioned he'd love to have Stephanie and me over for dinner. Soon, just family. Maybe we could discuss the investment opportunity then, but really he just wanted to spend time with us. My mom would love to see us, he said. I told him we'd check our schedules. Stephanie was in the room during this call, watching my face. After I hung up, she asked if I was actually considering his offer. I laughed. Not even a little bit. But I wanted to see how far he'd take this before he admitted he actually needed help. She got this look on her face, the one she gets when she's plotting something, and asked if I'd noticed how he kept calling late at night, when he was probably alone, probably stressed, probably unable to sleep. I hadn't thought about it that way, but yeah, she was right. Abraham was cracking. The family dinner happened the following Sunday. My mom Martha had texted separately, saying she'd love to see us, that it had been too long, totally casual invitation with no mention of business or investments. I knew Abraham had put her up to it, but I also knew my mom genuinely did want to see us. She'd been quieter than usual since the engagement party. I think she was embarrassed about Abraham's behavior, but didn't know how to address it without starting a fight with him. We showed up at their house around 2. My mom hugged both of us, commented on how good Stephanie looked, asked about married life. Abraham appeared from his office and shook my hand. Formal? Weird. He complimented Stephanie's dress. Even weirder. This was not how Abraham acted. He was performing, trying to be the gracious father, and it was unsettling to watch. Dinner was tense in a completely different way than usual. Abraham asked about my work multiple times. Stephanie's work, our apartment, all with this forced interest that felt calculated. My mom kept glancing between us like she was waiting for something to explode. Finally, over dessert, Abraham brought up the property again. He laid out the whole situation. The commercial building needed significant updates to attract quality tenants. He had the expertise, but not the liquid capital right now to do the renovations properly. If I came in as a partner, we could split the costs and the profits. He'd handle all the management, I'd just be an investor, learn the business from the inside. He made it sound like he was doing me a favor. I asked how much capital he needed. He named a figure that made my mom's eyes widen. Not a small amount. Not something you ask your son for casually over Sunday dinner. I sat with that number for a minute, then asked why he didn't just get a commercial loan or bring in one of his actual business partners. Abraham's jaw tightened. He said the banks were being difficult about terms right now, and his existing partners were tapped out on other projects. This building was important to him, had been in his portfolio for years. He wanted to keep it in the family, wanted to bring me into the family business properly, the way he'd always hoped. There it was. The manipulation, the reframing of years of insults and dismissal into this narrative where he'd always wanted me involved, had always believed in me. Stephanie's foot touched mine under the table, warning me not to blow up. I told Abraham I'd need to see the full financials on the property. Income statements, expense reports, projected costs for renovations, everything. If he wanted me to invest that kind of money, I needed to do proper due diligence. He looked surprised, like he'd expected me to just agree or just refuse, not ask for documentation. He said, of course, he'd get me everything I needed. My mom jumped in then, saying how wonderful it would be for us to work together, how Abraham had so much knowledge to share. I could tell she genuinely believed this was a good thing, that maybe it would fix whatever was broken between Abraham and me. She didn't understand that nothing was broken. Abraham had deliberately created this dynamic, and now he was scrambling because he needed something from me. We left after promising to review the financials. In the car, Stephanie asked what I was thinking. I told her I wanted to see exactly how bad Abraham's situation was. The numbers would tell me everything. She asked if I was actually going to invest. I said no, but I wanted him to believe I might. I wanted him to put in the effort, send me all his private business information, expose exactly how desperate he really was. The financials arrived 2 days later. Abraham dropped them off personally, handed me a folder thick with documents, told me to take my time reviewing everything and call him with questions. I spent that evening going through page by page. Stephanie ordered food and sat with me, asking questions about what different numbers meant. Here's what I found. Abraham wasn't just having tenant problems. He'd overextended himself on 3 different properties over the past 2 years. Bought at what he thought was the right time, but the market had shifted. His occupancy rates were down across his entire portfolio. He'd been covering gaps with reserves, but those reserves were running low. The building he wanted me to invest in was actually his biggest problem property. High overhead, outdated systems, and he'd already sunk money into basic repairs that didn't improve its rentability. He wasn't offering me an opportunity. He was trying to offload his problem onto me while making it sound like a favor. I sat back and just looked at these numbers. This man who'd spent years telling me I didn't understand real business, who'd mocked my startup and my choices and my life, was now drowning in his own decisions and needed me to bail him out. And he still couldn't just ask directly. Had to frame it as teaching me, bringing me into the fold, family legacy. Stephanie saw my face and asked what I was going to do. I told her I was going to make Abraham wait. Let him wonder if I was seriously considering it. Let him get more desperate. She asked how long. I said as long as it takes for him to actually be honest with me about what's happening. That weekend, my cousin Edward called. We hadn't talked since the engagement party, and honestly, I'd been fine with that. He wanted to grab lunch, catch up. Said it had been too long. I knew Abraham had sent him, but I was curious about what angle they were working, so I agreed to meet him. We met at this barbecue place near his office on a Thursday afternoon. Edward did the usual small talk, asked about Stephanie, congratulated me on the wedding. Then he started talking about family, about Abraham, about how Abraham had always wanted the best for me even if his methods were rough, that Abraham was old school, didn't know how to express things properly, but he was proud of me deep down. I just ate my food and let Edward talk. He eventually got to the point. Abraham had mentioned possibly working together on a property investment. Edward thought it was a great idea. Might be good for my relationship with Abraham, show him I was serious about building wealth the right way. And besides, Abraham had been stressed lately, could use family support. I asked Edward if he knew the actual state of Abraham's portfolio. Edward got defensive, said Abraham's business was solid. He'd been successful for decades. I asked if he'd seen the numbers on the specific property Abraham wanted me to invest in. Edward admitted he hadn't, but he trusted Abraham's judgment. So I told him. Laid out the occupancy rates, the repair costs, the negative cash flow. Edward's face changed as I talked. He tried to argue that all real estate goes through cycles, that Abraham knew what he was doing. I agreed that real estate was cyclical, but taking on a partner to cover your cash flow problems wasn't a cycle. It was desperation. Edward got quiet. Then he asked how I knew all this. I told him Abraham had given me the financials himself when asking me to invest. Edward processed that, and I could see him realizing that Abraham was in worse shape than anyone knew. He asked what I was going to do. I said I hadn't decided yet. We finished lunch with Edward looking uncomfortable and me feeling satisfied. I knew he'd report back to Abraham. Knew Abraham would know that I'd actually analyzed the numbers instead of just being flattered by the attention. This was me showing Abraham that I wasn't the naive kid he could manipulate. 2 days later, Abraham called again. Different tone this time. Less salesman, more direct. He asked if I'd reviewed the financials. I said I had. He asked what I thought. I told him the property looked like a significant risk with unclear upside. Long silence. Then Abraham said that with the right improvements in management, it could be turned around, that he had plans for repositioning it in the market. I asked why he didn't just use his own capital if he was so confident in the turnaround. He finally admitted he'd allocated his resources to other properties and was temporarily cash constrained. Temporarily. Like this was just a minor timing issue and not a pattern of overextension. I told him I'd need time to think about it, that Stephanie and I had to discuss any major investment decisions together. He asked how long I needed. I said I'd let him know. He didn't like that answer, but he accepted it. That night, Stephanie asked if I was enjoying this, making him wait, watching him squirm. I told her honestly, yeah, I was. After years of him making me feel small and incompetent, watching him need me, and knowing I was going to say no, it felt good. She said she got it, but she also asked what my endgame was. Just making him suffer? Or was I building to something bigger? I'd been thinking about that exact question. The answer was bigger. I didn't just want Abraham to know I didn't need him. I wanted him to understand that his entire framework for measuring success was flawed, that he'd been wrong about me from the start, that his way wasn't the only way, wasn't even necessarily the best way, but I also wanted him to admit it. Out loud? To me. To the family. I wanted the same people who'd laughed at his engagement party speech to see him need help from the son he'd called useless. My mom called the next morning. She wanted to have coffee, just the two of us. We met at a place near her gym where she goes after her morning class. She looked tired. She said Abraham had been stressed lately, working long hours, not sleeping well. She knew he'd asked me about the investment opportunity, and she hoped I was considering it, not for the business reasons, but because she thought working together might help us understand each other better. I told her gently that Abraham and I didn't have a misunderstanding problem. We had a respect problem, that he'd spent years making it clear he didn't respect my choices or my intelligence. And now he needed something from me. And suddenly I was worth his time. My mom got tears in her eyes. She said she knew Abraham could be hard on me, that his father had been hard on him the same way, that he showed love through pushing people through high expectations. I told her that wasn't love. It was control, and I was done being controlled. She asked what I was going to tell him about the investment. I said I was going to say no, but I hadn't decided when. She looked defeated, asked if there was anything that would change my mind. I told her, yeah, Abraham could start by apologizing for the engagement party, for every comment and insult and public humiliation over the past 3 years. Then maybe we could talk. My mom said she'd talk to him. I told her not to bother. Abraham wasn't going to apologize. He was going to get angry that I'd told her about any of this, and he was going to blame me for turning her against him. She started to protest, but I could see in her face that she knew I was right. I left that coffee meeting feeling bad for my mom, but not bad enough to change my plans. She'd enabled Abraham's behavior for decades. Never pushed back, never defended me, just kept the peace and hoped things would get better on their own. Abraham texted that evening asking if we could talk. I didn't respond immediately. Let him wait overnight. By morning, he'd sent 2 more texts. I finally replied saying I was busy with work, but we could talk next week. He called immediately. I didn't answer. This is where we are now. Abraham's spiraling, trying different tactics, getting more desperate. Me holding all the cards and deciding exactly how slowly to play them. Part 3 coming, because trust me, it gets better. Update 2. All right, buckle up because the comments were right. Abraham did not take rejection well. And honestly, watching this unfold has been better than I could have planned. So I made Abraham wait almost 2 weeks before I gave him my answer about the investment. 2 weeks of him calling, texting, having my mom reach out, even having Edward message me on Instagram asking if we could talk about family stuff. I ignored most of it, responded to some with vague busy with work. We'll get back to you soon type messages. Let him sit in that uncertainty while his cash flow problems got worse. Finally, I called him on a Friday evening. Stephanie was next to me on the couch and, yeah, I put him on speaker because she'd earned the right to hear this. I told Abraham I'd thought carefully about his offer, reviewed all the financials multiple times, discussed it extensively with Stephanie, and our answer was no. We weren't interested in investing in the property. Silence. Long enough that I thought maybe the call had dropped. Then Abraham asked why not. His tone was careful, controlled. I told him the numbers didn't work for us, the risk was too high, and we had other priorities for our capital right now. He asked what other priorities. I said that was our business. He didn't like that. Abraham shifted tactics. Started talking about how this was more than just an investment. It was family, it was legacy. It was me finally taking my place in the real business world instead of playing with apps and software. There it was. Even when he needed me, he couldn't help himself. Had to take a shot at my work. I told him my tech company was doing fine, actually better than fine, and we were making strategic decisions about where to allocate resources. He laughed. That condescending laugh I'd heard my whole life. Said sure, whatever made me feel successful. But this was a chance to learn from someone who'd actually built real wealth, who understood real assets. Stephanie grabbed my hand because she could feel me getting angry. I took a breath and told Abraham that I understood real assets just fine, which was exactly why I was passing on a property with declining occupancy rates and deferred maintenance issues that would cost more to fix than he was admitting. That shut him up. He asked where I was getting my information. I reminded him that he had given me all the financials, that I'd actually read them and done the analysis he apparently assumed I wasn't capable of. He got defensive, said I was misreading the situation, that I didn't have the experience to interpret commercial real estate numbers properly. I told him the numbers spoke for themselves and maybe he should find an investor who couldn't read them as clearly. Abraham's voice changed then. got harder. He said he'd offered me an opportunity out of generosity to help me build something real, and I was throwing it back in his face because of what? Pride? Spite? Was I still upset about some jokes at the engagement party? I needed to grow up and stop being so sensitive. And there it was. Jokes. He'd called it jokes. Public humiliation in front of 40 people, filmed on multiple phones, shared who knows where. All just jokes that I was too sensitive about. I told Abraham that his financial problems weren't my responsibility to solve, especially not when he couldn't even acknowledge what he'd done. He started arguing that he didn't have financial problems. This was just strategic portfolio management, and I was reading too much into normal business fluctuations. I said, okay. Then he didn't need my money. Good luck with his strategic portfolio management. I hung up. Stephanie just looked at me and started laughing, this amazed kind of laugh, because even desperate Abraham couldn't admit he was wrong about anything. My phone started ringing again immediately. I declined the call. He called 3 more times over the next hour. I declined all of them. Then the texts started. Long ones about how I was making a mistake, how I'd regret not learning from his experience, how Stephanie was clearly influencing me to make bad decisions. That last one made me actually angry. Blaming Stephanie for my choices was classic Abraham deflection. I didn't respond to any of the texts. Just screenshot them and saved them. Not for any legal reason, but because I wanted to remember exactly how he acted when he didn't get what he wanted. The next day, Saturday, my mom called. She was crying. Said Abraham had been up all night, was furious, kept ranting about how I was being manipulated and making terrible decisions. She asked me to reconsider. Just think about it more. Maybe there was a compromise. I told her there was no compromise on this. Abraham needed to figure out his own business problems. She said I was being cruel. That family was supposed to help each other. I asked her where that philosophy was when Abraham was mocking me at my own engagement party, when he was telling everyone I was useless, when he was making my uncles laugh about how quickly Stephanie would leave me. My mom went quiet. Then she said Abraham loved me in his own way, that I needed to understand how hard it was for him to ask for help, that this was actually progress in our relationship. I told her it wasn't progress, it was desperation, and I wasn't going to reward years of disrespect just because Abraham finally needed something. My mom said she didn't recognize me anymore, that I'd become harsh and unforgiving. I told her I'd become someone who didn't accept being treated like garbage, and maybe she should try it sometime. She hung up on me. Stephanie asked if I was okay. I told her, yeah, actually. That conversation with my mom had been coming for years. She'd chosen Abraham's side every single time, made excuses for his behavior, asked me to be the bigger person while never asking him to be a better person. I was done with that dynamic. Sunday afternoon, Edward showed up at our apartment. Didn't call first, just knocked on the door. Stephanie answered because I was in the shower. And when I came out, Edward was sitting on our couch looking uncomfortable, while Stephanie made extremely pointed small talk about how interesting it was when people showed up unannounced. Edward said he needed to talk to me about Abraham, that the situation was worse than I knew. I told him I knew exactly how bad the situation was. I'd read the financials, remember? Edward said no, I didn't understand. Abraham had been using him, had gotten Edward to invest in another property 6 months ago with promises about returns and partnership opportunities, and now that property was having the same tenant problems. Edward was in deep, had put in money he couldn't really afford to lose, and Abraham kept telling him to be patient. So Edward wasn't there for Abraham. He was there because he was scared about his own investment. He wanted to know if I had any insight into Abraham's overall portfolio health, if I thought things would turn around. I asked if he'd seen financials on his investment property. He said Abraham told him everything was fine, just temporary market conditions. I asked if he had that in writing. He didn't. I told Edward straight out that Abraham's portfolio was overextended and getting worse, that Abraham was scrambling to cover cash flow problems across multiple properties, that Edward should probably talk to a lawyer about his investment and what protections he had. Edward's face went pale. He started asking if Abraham was going to lose everything, if Edward's money was just gone. I said I wasn't a financial advisor and couldn't tell him what would happen, but if I were him, I'd want documentation of every promise Abraham had made and every dollar I'd put in. Edward just sat there processing this. Then he asked why I hadn't warned him before. I pointed out that we hadn't exactly been close, and besides, he'd been right there at the engagement party laughing along with everyone else. Why would I go out of my way to protect him? Edward got defensive, said that was just Abraham being Abraham, that everyone knew he had a rough sense of humor, that I shouldn't take it so personally. I told him he could see himself out. Stephanie agreed, stood up and walked to the door, held it open. Edward left looking shell-shocked. After he was gone, Stephanie said that was cold. I asked if she thought I should have warned him. She said no, she just noticed I was getting better at this, at not letting people guilt me into doing things against my own interests. I told her I'd had a good teacher, gestured at her. She smiled. Monday morning, I got a text from my uncle, Abraham's brother, who I'd heard in the garage talking about how Stephanie would leave me. He wanted to meet for lunch to discuss a business matter. I knew Abraham had sent him, but I was curious what angle they'd try now, so I agreed. We met at a sports bar on Tuesday. My uncle spent 20 minutes doing the family connection routine, talking about how he'd watched me grow up, how proud he was that I'd built something with my tech company, how he'd always believed in me even when Abraham was hard on me. All lies, but I let him talk. Then he got to it. He said Abraham was going through a rough patch, nothing serious but temporary cash flow stuff. And wouldn't it be nice if I could step up and help out family? Not as an investment, but as a loan. Family helping family? He'd make sure Abraham paid me back with interest. Would even co-sign if that made me more comfortable. I asked him why he didn't loan Abraham the money himself if family was so important. He said his capital was tied up in the business. I asked what business, Abraham's business that they ran together? He said yeah, exactly, so he couldn't pull money out without hurting the whole operation. I said so he wanted me to risk my money instead of his own. He started backtracking, saying it wasn't about risk, it was about family solidarity. I told him I remembered being in the garage at my engagement party, remembered hearing him and another uncle discussing how pathetic I was, how Stephanie would wise up and leave me, how I was one missed paycheck from begging Abraham forever. Did he remember that conversation? Because I'd never forgotten it. My uncle's face changed. He tried to deny it, said I must have misheard, that he'd never say those things. I described the exact location in the garage, the time, what they were drinking. His denial shifted to excuses. It was just guy talk, just blowing off steam, didn't mean anything serious. I asked how his perspective had changed so dramatically in 14 months. Back then, I was a broke clown. Now I was someone worth hitting up for a loan? He got irritated, said I was holding grudges over nothing, that I needed to move past small grievances and look at the bigger picture. The bigger picture being that Abraham needed money and I should provide it. I told him no. Simple as that. He pushed back, said Abraham had helped me over the years, given me cheap rent, let me use his car. I said I'd paid rent every month and returned the car in better condition than I got it, so we were even. My uncle said I was being selfish and short-sighted. That family was supposed to support each other in hard times. I pointed out that when I was starting my business and asked Abraham for a loan, I was told no, told to get a real job, told to stop playing entrepreneur. Where was family support then? He said that was different, that Abraham was trying to teach me lessons. I said, cool, lesson learned. Don't expect help from family who spent years telling you you're worthless. The lunch ended badly. My uncle paid for his meal and left before I even got my food. I sat there eating a burger by myself, reading messages from Stephanie asking how it was going. I told her Abraham had now sent his brother to guilt me into a loan. She sent back a string of laughing emojis and said she wished she could see Abraham's face when he found out this didn't work either. That night, Abraham called again. I answered because I wanted to hear what he'd say after sending his brother to me. He asked if I'd talked to my uncle. I said yeah, we'd had lunch. Abraham asked if we'd discussed anything important. I told him we'd discussed how Abraham had created a family culture where everyone felt entitled to use each other. And I was opting out of that culture. Abraham lost it, started yelling about respect, about how I wouldn't have anything if not for him, how my business was built on his foundation, how I was nothing without the education he paid for and the support he'd given. I let him yell, waited until he ran out of steam. Then I told him calmly that my business was built on 3 years of 18-hour days, on learning from failures, on clients who valued what we created, that my education was valuable, but plenty of people had degrees and didn't build successful companies, that his support had been minimal at best and hostile at worst. He went quiet. Then he asked what exactly I wanted from him, like this was a negotiation, like I was holding out for better terms. I told him I didn't want anything from him, which was apparently a concept he couldn't process. He asked if I wanted an apology for the engagement party. I said it was way past the point where an apology would matter. He said then what? Did I want him to beg? To lose everything? Was I trying to destroy him? I told him I wasn't trying to do anything to him. I was just living my life and protecting my own interests, which happened to not include bailing him out of problems he'd created. He said I'd regret this, that I was burning bridges I might need someday. I told him the bridges had burned a long time ago. I was just done pretending they hadn't. He hung up on me. 10 minutes later, my mom called crying again. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail saying I was tearing the family apart, that Abraham was beside himself, that she didn't understand when I'd become so cold. I saved it but didn't respond. Stephanie came home from work and found me on the couch just sitting in the quiet. She asked what happened. I told her about the call with Abraham, about my mom's voicemail. She sat next to me and asked the same question she'd asked before. What was my endgame here? I told her honestly, I wanted Abraham to hit bottom, wanted him to face actual consequences for his choices and his behavior, wanted him to understand what it felt like to need help from someone who had no reason to give it. And then, when he was at his lowest, when he'd exhausted every manipulation and guilt trip and family connection, I wanted to show him exactly how successful I'd become without him. Stephanie asked when. I said soon. Very soon. Final update coming. This ends exactly how Abraham deserves. Final update. So this is it. The ending you've all been waiting for, and honestly, it played out better than I could have scripted. 3 weeks after my last update, things accelerated. Abraham lost another tenant. A big one. Anchor tenant. In his main commercial building. The one he'd been counting on to stabilize his cash flow while he figured out the other properties. I found out because my mom called Stephanie directly, which was a new tactic. She told Stephanie that Abraham was in real trouble, that she was worried about losing their house if things didn't turn around, that she needed Stephanie to talk sense into me. Stephanie told her we'd discuss it and call her back. Then she told me about the conversation, and we both just sat there processing the fact that it had gotten that bad. Their house. Abraham had leveraged their personal residence for the business. My mom hadn't mentioned that detail in any of her previous calls. I told Stephanie I wanted to see Abraham in person. Not at their house, not at some restaurant where he could perform. Somewhere neutral, where we could talk without my mom intervening or him storming off. Stephanie asked what I was going to say. I told her everything, all of it, no more waiting. I texted Abraham and said we needed to meet. He responded in under a minute asking when and where. I told him Friday afternoon at a park near his office, the one with the pavilion and picnic tables. Public enough that he'd have to control himself, but private enough for a real conversation. Friday came. I got there first, sat at one of the concrete tables. Abraham showed up 10 minutes late, which was typical. He looked tired, really tired. Bags under his eyes, hadn't shaved properly. Suit was clean, but rumpled. This wasn't the Abraham who commanded every room he walked into. He sat down across from me and asked what this was about. I told him we needed to clear the air about everything. He said if I'd changed my mind about the investment, he'd be willing to negotiate better terms. I said no, this wasn't about investment. This was about him understanding who I actually am versus who he's decided I am. Abraham looked confused. I started talking. Told him that when I asked him for a loan 3 years ago for the startup, he'd said no. And I'd been angry but also relieved. Because his rejection meant I didn't owe him anything. Meant that whatever I built was mine. Not something he could claim credit for or hold over me. I told him the startup had closed Series A funding 6 months before the engagement party, that my equity stake was worth 7 figures on paper, that we'd signed contracts with 3 national retailers by the time he was making jokes about me being broke at my own engagement party, that every word out of his mouth that night had been based on assumptions, not reality. Abraham stared at me, asked why I hadn't told him. I said because he'd never asked. He'd never once asked how the business was actually doing, what our revenue was, who our clients were. He'd decided I was failing and that was all he needed to know. I kept going. Told him that Stephanie and I structured our expenses the way we did deliberately, that she paid more rent because I was putting money into the business and into savings, that we were partners with a plan, not a broke guy mooching off his girlfriend, that the apartment he thought I couldn't afford without his charity, I could have afforded a nicer place, but we were being strategic about expenses while building equity. I told him about the car. How I'd saved enough to buy my own months before I actually did. How I kept driving his old Lexus because it seemed wasteful to have 2 vehicles when we were planning to live together. How his gift had become a symbol of his control rather than generosity. Abraham tried to interrupt, tried to say something about how was he supposed to know all this. I told him to listen, that I wasn't done. I told him about standing in his driveway after the engagement party, hearing my uncles in the garage betting on how long until Stephanie left me, hearing them laugh about how pathetic I was. How Abraham had created an environment where the entire family felt comfortable mocking me because he'd established that as acceptable. I told him that when he called asking for investment help, I'd known immediately what was happening, had reviewed his financials and seen exactly how overextended he was, had watched him try every manipulation tactic he knew, family obligation, teaching opportunity, legacy building, anything except honest communication about needing help. Abraham's face was red. He said he'd been trying to include me, trying to bring me into the real business world. I laughed. Told him that was exactly the problem. His version of inclusion meant me conforming to his definition of success. meant him being in charge and me being grateful. It had nothing to do with actual partnership or respect. I told him the tech business closed Series B funding 3 months ago, that my equity stake had increased substantially, that we had expansion plans into 4 new markets and a partnership with a major distribution platform, that by any objective measure, I was successful, just not in the way he'd decided success had to look. Abraham asked why I was telling him all this now. What did I want? An apology? Money? I told him I didn't want anything from him anymore, that I was telling him because I needed him to understand that his framework for measuring worth was broken, that he'd been wrong about me, wrong about my business, wrong about my relationship, wrong about everything. He got defensive, started arguing that he'd had legitimate concerns, that startups fail all the time, that he was just being realistic. I cut him off, told him realistic would have been asking questions, gathering information, understanding the actual situation. What he'd done was assume, judge, and mock. Those weren't the same thing. I told him about the family gathering coming up in 2 weeks, my mom's birthday dinner that the whole extended family attended every year. I said I'd be there and I'd be bringing something to share. Not a gift from my mom, though I'd bring that too. Something for everyone. He asked what I meant. I told him he'd see. We sat in silence for a minute. Then Abraham asked if there was anything he could do to fix this. Fix us. I told him honestly, I didn't think so. That he'd spent years building a relationship based on control and conditional approval, and I'd finally stopped playing that game. That I was done trying to earn his respect or prove my worth to him. He asked about the business problems he was facing, if I'd reconsider helping. I told him no. That he'd made it clear over and over that he didn't respect my judgment or my capabilities. Why would I invest my money with someone who thought I was incompetent? He didn't have an answer. I left him sitting at that picnic table, drove home, and told Stephanie how it went. She asked if I felt better. I said, yeah, actually. That saying all of it out loud to Abraham's face had been necessary. She asked about the birthday dinner. I told her to trust me. The next week was quiet. No calls from Abraham, no texts from my mom. Radio silence. I knew they were talking about what I'd said, trying to figure out their next move. Edward sent me a message on Instagram asking if I was really worth what I'd told Abraham. I didn't respond. My mom's birthday dinner happened on a Saturday evening at their house. The whole family came. Both my uncles, Edward, a few cousins, my mom's sister, about 20 people total. Similar crowd to the engagement party, actually. We arrived right on time. My mom hugged us both, looked nervous. Abraham nodded at me from across the room. Dinner was tense. Lots of careful conversation, people avoiding certain topics. Edward kept looking at me like he was waiting for something to happen. After we ate, after cake, after the usual birthday rituals, I stood up, told everyone I wanted to share some news while we were all together. The room went quiet. My mom looked panicked. Abraham's jaw tightened. I told the whole family about the business, about Series A and Series B funding, about our client list, about expansion plans. Pulled out my phone and showed them our company's latest valuation. Showed them articles from trade publications featuring our platform. Showed them everything Abraham had never asked to see. I told them that when Abraham made jokes about me at the engagement party, filming it and laughing, I'd been closing deals and building something real. That while my uncles were in the garage betting on when Stephanie would leave me, we were planning a life together based on actual partnership, not the transactional relationship Abraham had modeled. I looked at Edward specifically and told him that Abraham had tried to get him to invest in a failing property while knowing his own portfolio was in trouble. That Edward should protect himself legally if he hadn't already. Edward's face went pale. His wife grabbed his arm. I told my uncles that their entertainment in the garage that night had cost them any relationship with me going forward. That I didn't need family who waited for me to fail so they could feel better about their own choices. Then I looked at Abraham, told him that everything he'd said about me for the past 3 years had been projection, that he'd been failing while calling me a failure, that he'd been desperate while calling me needy, that he'd measured my worth in money while making bad financial decisions himself. I told the room that Abraham had asked me for investment help, had sent my uncle to guilt me into giving him money, had used my mom to pressure Stephanie, that I'd said no because you don't reward people who've spent years disrespecting you. My mom started crying. One of my cousins tried to say something about family needing to support each other. I told her that Abraham hadn't supported me when I was building my business, hadn't believed in me, hadn't even bothered to ask real questions about what I was doing, that his version of support only existed when he needed something. Abraham stood up. His face was red, hands shaking. He said I was being cruel, that I was embarrassing him in front of everyone, that this was inappropriate. I asked him if it was more or less appropriate than his engagement party speech. He didn't answer, Stephanie squeezed my hand. I told everyone that we were leaving, that we'd celebrated my mom's birthday and now we were done. That anyone who wanted a relationship with us going forward needed to understand we weren't playing these family games anymore. No more accepting disrespect for the sake of peace. No more being the punching bag so everyone else felt better. We left, walked out to our car while the entire family sat in stunned silence. My phone started blowing up before we even got home. Edward asking if what I'd said about Abraham's portfolio was true. My mom's sister asking what was going on. One of my cousins saying I'd ruined the party. I turned my phone off. Stephanie did the same. We spent the evening watching movies and eating takeout, and honestly, it felt amazing. Like I'd finally put down weight I'd been carrying for years. Monday morning, I turned my phone back on. 43 messages. Most from family members taking sides or demanding explanations. 3 from Abraham. I read his messages. The first was angry, saying I'd crossed a line, that I'd humiliated him the same way I claimed he'd humiliated me. The second was 12 hours later, more measured, saying we needed to talk like adults. The third was from that morning, asking if we could meet again. I didn't respond to any of them. Deleted most of the family messages without reading them fully. Saved a few for documentation purposes. Not because I planned to do anything with them, but because I'd learned to keep records. Edward called. I answered because I was curious. He said he'd gone through his investment documents with a lawyer like I'd suggested. Found out Abraham had been way less transparent than he'd thought. Edward's money was in bad shape, might be mostly gone. He asked if I'd known this would happen when I said no to Abraham's investment request. I told him I'd known Abraham's properties were struggling, that the numbers were clear if you actually looked at them. Edward asked if I'd refused partly to protect myself from being dragged down with Abraham. I said yeah, obviously. He hung up without saying goodbye. That week I found out through family channels that Abraham had to sell 2 properties at a loss, that he was restructuring debt, that he'd had to have a serious conversation with my mom about their financial situation, that he was trying to bring in new partners to salvage what was left. None of this made me feel guilty. He'd made his choices. My mom called 2 weeks later, asked if we could talk, just her and me. I met her at that same coffee place where we'd talked before. She looked older, worn out. She said Abraham was humiliated, that the whole family was talking about what happened at her birthday dinner, that she didn't know how to fix any of this. I told her there was nothing to fix, that I'd finally established boundaries that should have existed all along. She said I'd destroyed Abraham's reputation, that people were questioning his business judgment now. I said people should question it. His judgment had been bad. That's not my fault for pointing it out. My mom asked what I wanted. What would make this better? I told her the same thing I'd told Abraham. I didn't want anything anymore. I'd stopped waiting for approval or validation from people who'd made it clear they didn't respect me. She asked if I was cutting them out of my life completely. I said I hadn't decided yet, but if we did maintain contact, it would be on completely different terms. No more accepting casual disrespect. No more family gatherings where I was the punchline. She started crying again. Said she'd tried her best. That she'd wanted Abraham to be kinder but didn't know how to change him. I told her she'd enabled him for decades, made excuses for him, asked me to absorb his behavior instead of asking him to change it. That I was done absorbing. We finished coffee mostly in silence. She hugged me before I left, whispered that she loved me. I told her I loved her too, but love wasn't enough to make me accept mistreatment. She nodded like she understood. That's where things are now. Abraham's business is struggling publicly. The family dynamics have completely shifted. Some people are on his side. Some are questioning everything. Some have reached out to me privately to apologize or say they always knew Abraham was too hard on me. I'm polite to those people, but distant. Stephanie and I are focusing on our life, our business, our future. The startup is doing great, by the way. We're in acquisition talks with a larger company. Nothing definite yet, but promising. My equity stake could become actual liquid money soon. The kind of money Abraham spent years telling me I'd never make. Sometimes I think about the engagement party, about standing there smiling while people laughed, while phones filmed my humiliation, about Abraham's speech and Edward's joke about being adopted, and the uncles in the garage predicting my failure. I think about how all of them were so certain I'd come crawling back, begging for help, proving them right. Instead, they came to me, desperate, manipulative, trying every tactic except honest respect. And I said no. Over and over, in every way that mattered, I said no. That's the revenge, really. Not destroying Abraham, he did that himself. Not some elaborate scheme, just living well, succeeding on my own terms, and refusing to save someone who'd spent years trying to make me feel worthless. Abraham finally realized what I'd done. I'd built a life where I didn't need him, where his approval was meaningless, where his insults couldn't touch me because I'd stopped measuring myself against his broken standards. And yeah, watching him panic when he figured that out, that made me smile.